This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's jump into another deep dive. This time, we're tackling a pretty heavy topic. The decision to use atomic bombs on Japan back in 1945. You sent in a podcast episode, and wow, this is a big one.
Definitely a turning point in history.
It's more than just history, though, right? This is about how we got to the nuclear age, the world we live in now.
Absolutely. It's a decision that still impacts us today, no doubt. To really get it, we got to go back to 1945, put ourselves right there.
Okay, so, set the scene for me. Summer 45, World War II, where are we at?
Well, the war in Europe, that's over. But the Pacific, that's a whole other story. Japan's been fighting the U.S. and the Allies for almost 4 years by this point. Brutal fighting.
I remember learning about the firebombing of Tokyo, just how devastating that was. Over 100,000 people killed.
Yeah.
You'd think that would be enough to, force surrender.
You'd think, right. But even with those raids, even with that level of destruction, Japan's infrastructure, it wasn't totally wiped out. The railway networks, the places where they made weapons, even how they moved coal, still working. So they could still produce for the war, move troops around, surprisingly intact. And on top of that,
What?
they were incredibly committed to the fight, both the military and even the civilian population.
Hold on, how many troops are we even talking about at this point? I think millions ready to defend their homeland. A lot of young men, yeah, but also civilian volunteers, even teenagers trained to fight to the death, and aircraft. They still had thousands, many ready for those kamikaze attacks.
Kamikaze attacks. That's...
Oh, and fuel. They had enough for thousands more of those missions. Just imagine the dedication, the desperation on both sides.
It's kind of hard to fathom that level of commitment.
It's a product of their warrior culture.
Yeah.
And definitely some serious propaganda convincing people that surrender was simply not an option. So you've got this incredibly determined enemy, but the U.S. must have been feeling the pressure too. I mean, the war had been going on for years at this point.
Oh, absolutely. Especially after Okinawa.
Okinawa.
Yeah, just a few months before. That battle, it really showed how costly an invasion of mainland Japan would be.
How so?
Over 12,500 American soldiers killed in action, another 44,000 wounded. Plus, we lost so many aircraft, so many crew. It was a bloodbath, a real wake-up call for the American strategists.
Okinawa must have been a turning point in their thinking then. Like a glimpse into what a full-scale invasion could look like.
Exactly, a horrific glimpse. But even with all this going on, there were attempts at diplomacy. The Potsdam Declaration, you familiar with that?
Vaguely. Remind me.
It was issued in July of 45. Basically, it outlined the terms for Japan's surrender, warned them of prompt and utter destruction if they didn't accept.
And they didn't.
Well, not exactly. Instead of a clear yes or no, they responded with mokusatsu.
Ignore.
Right.
Or stay silent.
Yeah, but it's more nuanced than just ignoring. It's deeply rooted in Japanese culture. Mokatsu. It often meant they wanted more time to think it over, or maybe to save face in a tough spot. But the U.S., they saw it as a total rejection. Didn't help the situation.
So even with this attempt at diplomacy, things are escalating. Seems like both sides are kind of stuck, heading toward a bloody invasion.
That's the feeling, yeah. And that's where these casualty projections come in. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan.
Downfall.
Grim name, right? The estimates were just staggering. Anywhere from 270,000 to 1 million American casualties. And these numbers, they weren't just pulled out of thin air. They were based on, well, how fanatically the Japanese had defended places like Okinawa.
1 million casualties.
Yeah.
That's just unthinkable.
It was a very real possibility. Remember, the Japanese weren't just training soldiers. They were preparing everyone to resist. Civilians, I mean, everyone, even children. They were being taught how to use bamboo spears, for God's sake.
Wow. So you've got this war that's already claimed millions of lives, this potential invasion looming, and then the atomic bomb.
It's like something out of a sci-fi story suddenly becomes reality.
Right.
July 1945, they successfully test the atomic bomb. And now Truman. He's got this unimaginably powerful weapon. He thinks it might be a way to force Japan's surrender. Quickly. Maybe even save lives in the long run.
And that leads us to, I guess, one of the biggest questions of the 20th century. Was it really a military necessity? Or was it about something else, a power play?
Historians have been debating that for decades, and they still don't agree. Was it just a tool to end the war quickly, to prevent more bloodshed? Or was it maybe a way for America to show off its new power, especially with the Soviet Union on the rise?
It's like military strategy, global politics, the dawn of the atomic age, all tangled up together. What a backdrop for a decision like this.
It was a perfect storm of history, that's for sure. Yeah, a real convergence of forces in history. Almost impossible to fully grasp, you know? But in the middle of all this chaos, you've got Truman. He's got to make this decision. No president has ever faced anything like it.
Yeah, he's got, like, the weight of the world on his shoulders.
Yeah.
August 1945. Millions of lives hanging in the balance.
Imagine being in that position, right? Facing those casualty projections. 1 million American soldiers potentially dead or wounded, plus the stories coming back from the Pacific, the brutality, and then this new weapon, this bomb. It could end it all, just like that. It's got to be one of the biggest moral dilemmas in all of history.
But knowing what we know now about the effects of the atomic bomb, I mean, was it really the only way? Were there other options, other paths to peace that could have been explored more?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? That's what historians and ethicists are still arguing about today. Some say maybe they could have just, like, demonstrated the bomb's power, you know, not on a city, detonated on an uninhabited island or something. Maybe that would have shocked Japan into surrendering without all the death.
A show of force, but not on civilians.
Right. Or maybe offering different surrender terms, like letting them keep their emperor. Maybe that would have been enough. Maybe a negotiated peace was possible.
It makes you wonder, was the tragedy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki truly unavoidable? Or was it more about, like, missed opportunities, a failure of imagination on both sides?
Exactly. And we can't forget, even within Japan, there were people who wanted to surrender. Some leaders understood how bad things were. They wanted to negotiate. But the hardliners, those who wanted to keep fighting no matter what,
Yeah.
they won out in the end.
It's amazing how, even with a situation that seems so dire, so clear-cut, you can still have that level of disagreement, debates about the best course of action.
It shows you how complex things get in wartime. Nationalism, pride, fear, all these things playing a part. It's why we need to try to understand everyone's perspective, not just the winners. So let's go back to those events, how they actually unfolded. August 6th, 1945. Hiroshima. What happens?
First atomic bomb.
Right. It detonates above the city. Just wipes out everything within a 2-mile radius. Gone, just like that. Buildings vaporized, tens of thousands dead instantly. And the survivors. They're dealing with fire, destruction, and then there's the radiation sickness. A silent killer. Takes lives for years to come.
It's hard to even grasp the scale of suffering. And then, just 3 days later, Nagasaki.
Yeah, so it's a chilling fact that the original target for that second bomb, it wasn't Nagasaki, it was Kokura.
Right.
But the weather was bad, they couldn't see the target. So the crew, they diverted to the secondary target. Nagasaki. Again, immediate devastation. Tens of thousands dead.
And what about the Soviet Union? Didn't they declare war on Japan around this time?
Yeah, August 8th. Just one day before Nagasaki. They invaded Manchuria. Some historians say that was the real reason Japan surrendered, not the bombs. Others say no, it was the bombs. Probably it was both, a combination. Enough to finally force Emperor Hirohito to step in and start negotiating surrender.
So even after Hiroshima, the U.S. felt it had to go ahead with the second bombing.
It shows you their mindset. They wanted unconditional surrender, full stop. They wanted to break Japan completely. No more fighting, avoid that ground invasion, no matter what.
And finally, August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's surrender. World War II is over. Victory. But at what cost?
It's a victory, yeah. But people were relieved, of course, but there was this uneasiness, too. The world had seen a new kind of warfare, a level of destruction no one could have imagined. It was the end of the war, yes, but it was also the beginning of something else, the nuclear age. And we're still living in the shadow of that, still grappling with the consequences.
It's like we opened Pandora's box,
Yeah.
and it's not so easy to close it again.
That's a great way to put it. Because the bombings, they set off this whole arms race, mainly between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Just a few years later, the Soviets had their own bomb, and suddenly you have two superpowers, each capable of wiping the other one out.
The Cold War, then. All that tension, the fear.
Yeah.
It goes back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
It all started there. The bombings changed everything, the whole balance of power in the world. Nuclear war became a real possibility, not just a threat. And that shaped everything. International relations, military strategies, even domestic politics. For decades.
And it wasn't just those two superpowers either. Eventually, other countries got nuclear weapons. Made things even more complicated, more unpredictable.
And it's still a huge concern today. Nuclear proliferation, the more countries that have these weapons, the higher the risk of something going wrong. An accident, a miscalculation, or even someone using them on purpose. It's like we're always on the edge of a cliff.
It makes you think, can we ever really go back? Is a world without nuclear weapons even possible at this point?
It's a huge challenge, no doubt. But I wouldn't say it's impossible. We have seen some progress. Disarmament treaties, non-proliferation efforts. But there's a long way to go. It's going to take global cooperation, diplomacy, and everyone understanding how bad nuclear war would be.
Thinking about the Hibakusha, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they became such powerful advocates for peace and disarmament.
Their stories are a stark reminder, the human cost of nuclear war. They went through so much, not just the blasts, but the radiation poisoning, the long-term effects. They really became a voice for a world without nuclear weapons, a world without that threat hanging over us.
And that message feels more important than ever today, doesn't it? With everything going on in the world, the tensions, the possibility of these weapons falling into the wrong hands.
Absolutely. We can't let ourselves forget, can't become numb to the danger. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they remind us that we have a responsibility to do everything we can to prevent something like that from ever happening again.
So where do we go from here? How do we make sure that those two cities, those bombings, they weren't just the start of something terrible, but a turning point? How do we move toward a future where peace wins out?
It starts with us, with all of us. Education, understanding the history, the science, talking about these things, thinking through the ethical questions, supporting diplomacy, fighting for policies that promote peace, that get rid of these weapons.
Assembly isn't just something that happened in the past.
Yeah.
It's still happening. It's shaping who we are, the choices we make, the future we're building.
Well said. The atomic bombings. They were this huge turning point in human history. We saw what we're capable of, the destructive power we have, and we're still dealing with that today.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling hopeful, but also very aware of the responsibility we all share. We have the knowledge, we have the tools. We can choose a different path, one that leads away from destruction towards peace and human dignity.
It's a choice we have to make every single day. Thanks for joining us for this conversation, this exploration. It's been a deep dive for sure.
We're back. And wow, I'm still thinking about everything we just talked about, the atomic bombings. It's not just about Japan, is it? This was a huge turning point for the whole world. So what happened after? What were the long-term repercussions of unleashing that kind of power?
It really did change everything. I mean, it wasn't just the end of World War II. It was the beginning of something totally new, the nuclear age. And we're still living with that, right? Still figuring out what it means to have this incredibly destructive force, a force that we humans control.
It sounds like, I don't know, like we opened Pandora's box and now we can't close it.
That's a good way to think about it. Because, see, the atomic bombings, they kind of set off this global arms race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union mostly. Just a few years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviets developed their own bomb. So now you've got these two superpowers, and they both have the ability to, basically destroy each other.
So that's where the Cold War comes in then. All that tension, the fear of nuclear war. It goes back to those bombings in 1945.
Oh, absolutely. It all goes back to that. Because suddenly, nuclear war wasn't just some idea. It was a real possibility. And that changed everything. How countries dealt with each other, military strategy, even politics within countries. For decades.
And it wasn't just those two either. Other countries got nuclear weapons too. Made things even more messy.
Right, exactly. Nuclear proliferation. It's still a huge problem. I mean, think about it. The more countries that have these weapons, the more likely it is that something will go wrong. Someone could use them by accident, or misjudge a situation, or even, decide to use them on purpose. Scary to think about.
It really is. It's like, are we always going to be on edge? Is there any way to go back? Can we ever have a world without nuclear weapons?
Well, it's a tough question, a huge challenge. But I wouldn't say it's impossible. There have been some positive steps, treaties to limit nuclear weapons, efforts to stop them from spreading, but we need way more than that. It's got to be a global effort, countries working together, talking to each other, and really understanding how bad nuclear war would be for everyone.
And that's where I think the Hibakusha come in. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they became such powerful voices for peace, for getting rid of these weapons.
Yeah. Their stories are so important. They remind us what nuclear war really means, the human cost. They suffered so much, not just from the bombings themselves, but the radiation, the long-term effects. They're a powerful reminder that we need to do better. that we need a world without this threat hanging over us.
And with everything going on in the world today, that message feels more urgent than ever.
No question. We can't forget what happened, can't get used to the idea that nuclear war is just, a possibility. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they show us what's at stake. They remind us that we have a responsibility to prevent this from ever happening again.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, where do we go from here? How do we make sure those bombings weren't just the start of something awful? How do we create a future where peace wins out?
It starts with us, each and every one of us. Learning about what happened, understanding the science, the risks, talking about it, thinking about the ethics, the big questions, and then taking action, supporting diplomacy, working for peace, demanding policies that get rid of these weapons.
Because history isn't just something in the past, right? It's shaping our present, the choices we make, the world we're building. And it's up to us to decide what kind of world that will be.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The atomic bombings. They were a turning point, no doubt. They showed us how destructive we can be. And it's up to us to learn from that, to choose a different path.
This deep dive has been, well, it's been heavy, for sure. But it's also left me with a sense of, I don't know, maybe hope. We have the knowledge, we have the tools, and I believe we have the will to create a better future. A future where peace and human dignity prevail. It's a choice we have to make every single day.
Well said. Thanks for being part of this conversation, this deep dive. It's been a privilege.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.